James Carter was a man who took pride in his work. As a taxi driver in a busy city, he knew the streets like the back of his hand. Every day, he met different people, some polite, some rude, but he treated everyone with respect. That morning, the sun was shining, and the city was alive with activity. James hummed to himself as he navigated through traffic, ready for another day of work. Around noon, he received a call to pick up a passenger from an upscale shopping district. He pulled up to the curb and saw a well-dressed woman waving him down. Her name was Margaret Reeves. She looked impatient, tapping her foot as she waited for him to stop. James greeted her with a warm smile as she got into the back seat. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Where can I take you today?" James asked politely. Margaret barely glanced at him. "Just drive," she said curtly, handing him the address. Her tone was sharp, and her face was tense. James wasn't offended. He had met plenty of passengers who were having a bad day, and he figured she was no different. As they drove, Margaret began to fidget. She checked her phone repeatedly and sighed loudly. "Why are you taking this route?" she suddenly snapped. "This isn't the fastest way." James kept his voice calm and professional. "Ma'am, this route avoids the traffic downtown. It will save us time." Margaret rolled her eyes. "You don't know what you're talking about. Just take the route I told you." James nodded. "Of course, ma'am," he replied, adjusting his GPS to follow her instructions. He didn't argue, knowing it was better to stay composed. The car was silent for a few minutes, except for Margaret's occasional muttering under her breath. Then, without warning, she shouted, "Stop the car." James quickly pulled over, worried something was wrong. "Is everything okay, Mom?" he asked. Margaret glared at him. "You've been staring at me through the rearview mirror this whole time," she accused. "It's making me uncomfortable." James was stunned. "Ma'am, I assure you, I wasn't staring at you," he said calmly. "I was focused on the road." But Margaret wasn't listening. She opened the door and got out, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling the police," she declared. "You've been harassing me." James felt his stomach drop. He had done nothing wrong, but he knew how serious her accusation could be. A small crowd began to gather, curious about the commotion. Margaret's voice was loud, and her words carried weight. James stayed in the car, his hands resting on the steering wheel, trying to stay calm. He knew the situation could spiral out of control, but he also knew he had to handle it carefully. As the crowd grew and Margaret continued to shout, James couldn't help but wonder how this ordinary day had taken such a sudden and troubling turn. The street quickly became a scene of confusion as Margaret stood outside the taxi, waving her phone in the air and shouting accusations. "This man was staring at me and making me uncomfortable," she declared loudly. Passers-by stopped to watch, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. James remained seated in his taxi, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His heart raced, but he reminded himself to stay calm. He had done nothing wrong, and he believed the truth would come out. Still, the weight of Margaret's words hung heavily in the air. He knew how easily a false accusation could ruin a person's life. A young woman in the crowd stepped forward, her phone already recording. "What happened here?" she asked Margaret. "This driver wouldn't stop staring at me," Margaret exclaimed, her face flushed with anger. "It's harassment, and I'm calling the police." The young woman looked at James, her expression curious but calm. "Sir, is that true?" she asked. James shook his head firmly. "No, ma'am. I was just driving. I never stared at her or did anything inappropriate," he said, his voice steady but strained. "I was focused on the road." Margaret crossed her arms, her voice growing louder. "He's lying. I felt unsafe the entire ride. People like him shouldn't be allowed to drive taxis." The crowd murmured, and some looked skeptical. The young woman who had stepped forward turned to Margaret. "Do you have any proof?" she asked. "Did you record him or take a photo?" Margaret hesitated, her confidence wavering. "No," she admitted, but I know what I felt. Meanwhile, James decided to take action. Slowly, he reached for his dashboard camera. "Ma'am," he said to the young woman, "this car is equipped with a dash cam. It records both the road and the interior of the taxi. The footage will show exactly what happened." The crowd grew quiet, all eyes now on Margaret. Her expression changed, a flicker of worry crossing her face. She hadn't anticipated this. "Please, call the police," James said firmly, looking at Margaret. "I have nothing to hide. Let them review the footage." A few moments later, a police car pulled up, and two officers stepped out. Margaret hurried over to them, repeating her accusations. James calmly explained his side of the story and pointed to the dashcam. "Everything is recorded," he told the officers. "You can see for yourselves." One of the officers nodded and stepped into the taxi to retrieve the footage. The crowd watched in silence as the officer reviewed the video on a small screen. After a few minutes, the officer stepped out, his expression serious. He turned to Margaret. "Ma'am, the footage shows the driver was focused on the road the entire time. There's no evidence to support your claim." The crowd gasped, and Margaret's face turned pale. James felt a wave of relief but stayed composed. He knew the situation wasn't over yet. Margaret's regretful expression hinted that the truth had finally caught up with her, but James was prepared to ensure justice would be served. The police officer's words left the crowd buzzing with murmurs. Margaret, who moments ago was confidently accusing James, now stood frozen, her face a mix of shock and embarrassment. She opened her mouth to speak but couldn't find the words. The weight of the truth was undeniable, and the crowd began to see her accusations for what they were: false and baseless. James, still seated in his taxi, exhaled deeply. He felt a surge of relief but remained calm. His hands were still steady on the wheel as he watched the situation unfold. He wasn't the type to gloat or lash out. He simply wanted justice to be served. The young woman who had initially questioned Margaret stepped closer to James. "I'm so sorry this happened to you," she said softly. "You didn't deserve any of this." James nodded, grateful for her words. "Thank you," he replied. "It's not the first time something like this has happened, but I'm glad the truth came out this time." One of the officers turned to Margaret, his expression firm. "Ma'am, filing a false report is a serious offense," he said. "You accused this man without any evidence, and the dashcam footage proves he did nothing wrong. Do you understand the consequences of your actions?" Margaret's face turned pale. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she stammered. I thought he was staring at me." The officer's voice remained steady but firm. "Your assumptions could have caused significant harm to an innocent man. This is not something we take lightly." The crowd, which had initially been curious and skeptical, began to turn against Margaret. "You owe him an apology," someone called out. Others nodded in agreement, their voices growing louder. The once silent bystanders were now standing up for James, their support evident. Margaret hesitated, her pride battling with the weight of the situation. Finally, she stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry," she said, avoiding James's eyes. "I shouldn't have assumed the worst." James looked at her for a moment, his expression calm but serious. "An apology is a start," he said, "but what you did could have ruined my life. You need to think before you act." Margaret nodded, her face flushed with shame. The officers decided to let her go with a warning, but not without emphasizing the seriousness of her actions. "You're lucky this driver isn't pressing charges," one of them said. "We hope you'll learn from this." As the officers wrapped up the scene, the crowd began to disperse, some offering James words of support before leaving. The young woman who had defended him stayed a moment longer. "You handled that with so much grace," she said. "Thank you for standing up for yourself." James offered a small smile. "I just want to do my job without being judged for the way I look," he said. "That's all I ask." As he drove away, James couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. He was relieved that the truth had been revealed, but the sting of the accusation lingered. Still, he was determined not to let the experience define him. Instead, he chose to focus on the support he had received and the fact that, this time, justice had prevailed. The sun began to set as James drove away from the scene, his thoughts swirling. He was grateful that the truth had come out, but the experience had left him shaken. Accusations like Margaret's didn't just vanish. They stayed with you, leaving scars invisible to others. Still, James reminded himself of the support he had received from the crowd. It gave him hope that not everyone jumped to conclusions. He decided to call it a day. Pulling into a small diner he often visited, he parked his taxi and stepped inside. The warm smell of coffee and freshly baked pie greeted him. "James," the usual. The waitress, Carla, asked with a cheerful smile. James nodded. "Yeah, Carla. And maybe a slice of that apple pie," he said, trying to lift his spirits. As he waited for his meal, James pulled out his phone. To his surprise, he saw dozens of notifications. The video of the incident, recorded by several bystanders, had already gone viral. Comments flooded in, with people from all over expressing their outrage at Margaret's actions and their admiration for James's calm and professional demeanor. One comment read, "This man deserves respect for how he handled such an unfair situation. We need more people like him." Another said, "This is why dashcams are so important. Imagine if he didn't have proof of his innocence." James couldn't help but smile. For once, the narrative was in his favor. People were standing up for him, strangers who saw the truth and wanted justice. As Carla brought over his coffee and pie, she noticed the video on his phone. "Oh my gosh, James, is that you?" she asked, her eyes wide. James nodded, a small chuckle escaping him. "Yeah, that's me. It's been a day, Carla." She shook her head in disbelief. "Well, I'm glad people are seeing the real story. You didn't deserve any of that." The diner was quiet, but a few other patrons overheard the conversation and came over to talk to James. "We saw that video," one man said. "You handled it like a true gentleman. It's not easy to stay calm in a situation like that." James thanked them, feeling the warmth he hadn't expected. The support from these strangers reminded him that there was still good in the world, even when faced with prejudice. Later that evening, as James returned home, he received a message from his boss at the taxi company. It read, "James, I saw the video. We're all proud of you. You handled yourself with dignity, and we're lucky to have you on our team." James leaned back in his chair, feeling a sense of relief. The day had been hard, but it had also shown him the power of truth and the kindness of others. He made a silent promise to himself to keep moving forward, no matter what challenges came his way. As he prepared for bed, James thought about the events of the day. He knew this wasn't just his story. It was a reminder to everyone that fairness and honesty could prevail, even in the face of injustice. The following morning, James woke up to an unexpected wave of attention. His phone buzzed nonstop with calls, texts, and social media notifications. Friends, family, and even strangers reached out to offer their support. The video of the incident had gained traction overnight, and news outlets had picked it up. It was now being shared across the country. James hesitated to open the messages at first. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight and worried about the negativity that might come with it. But as he read through the comments and messages, he realized how much support he had. People admired his composure and professionalism in a tough situation. It was uplifting, but it also reminded him of the responsibility that came with his newfound visibility. Later that day, James received a call from his employer, Mr. Peterson, who owned the taxi company. "James," Mr. Peterson said, his voice warm and encouraging, "I saw the video. I just want you to know we're standing behind you 100%. You've shown incredible strength and professionalism. Thank you for representing the company so well." "Thank you, Mr. Peterson," James replied, feeling grateful for his boss's support. "I'm just glad the truth came out." After the call, James decided to step out for some fresh air. As he walked through his neighborhood, people recognized him from the video. Some stopped to shake his hand, while others offered kind words. "You're a good man," an older woman said. "The way you handled that situation inspired me." James nodded, humbled by her words. "Thank you, ma'am. I just did what I thought was right." As the day went on, James received another surprising call, this time from a local journalist. She wanted to interview him about his experience and how he had managed to stay calm in such a tense situation. James was hesitant at first, but eventually agreed. He felt it was important to share his story and use the opportunity to highlight the challenges many people like him faced. During the interview, the journalist asked, "James, what kept you calm during such a difficult moment?" James thought for a moment before answering. "I've been a taxi driver for years, and I've seen all kinds of people and situations," he said. "But my parents taught me something important when I was young, to always carry myself with dignity and to never let anger control me. That's what I held on to in that moment." The journalist nodded, impressed. "What message would you like to send to others who might face similar challenges?" James paused, choosing his words carefully. "I want people to remember that the truth matters, and so does kindness. We all have a responsibility to treat each other with respect, no matter who we are or where we come from." The interview aired that evening, and James's words resonated with many. As he sat in his living room with a cup of tea, he felt a sense of pride and peace. The challenges of the previous day had been tough, but they had also revealed the strength within him and the support around him. As the week went on, the story of James' encounter continued to spread, gaining more attention than he had ever imagined. News stations invited him for interviews, community leaders reached out to offer support, and even his regular passengers called to check in on him. James appreciated the kindness, but he also felt overwhelmed by all the attention. One morning, he received a call from the local mayor's office. "Mr. Carter," the assistant began warmly, "the mayor would like to invite you to a community meeting this weekend. We believe your experience can inspire change and help foster better understanding in our city." James hesitated. He wasn't used to public speaking, and the idea of standing in front of a crowd made him nervous. But he also knew that his story could make a difference. "All right," he said after a moment. "I'll be there." When Saturday arrived, James found himself standing in a large community center. The room was packed with people, city officials, community leaders, and everyday citizens. At the front of the room, a panel of speakers, including James, had been arranged. He felt the weight of their eyes on him as he sat waiting for his turn to speak. When it was finally his time, James stood and walked to the podium. His hands were steady, but his heart raced. Taking a deep breath, he looked out at the crowd and began to speak. "Good afternoon, everyone," he said, his voice calm but strong. "My name is James Carter, and I'm just a taxi driver. I don't see myself as anyone special, but something happened to me recently that reminded me how important it is to stand up for what's right." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "The truth is, what happened to me isn't new. There are many people out there who have faced false accusations or unfair treatment simply because of how they look. But this time, I had something that not everyone has, a dash cam to prove my innocence and the support of people who believed in me." The room was silent, everyone hanging on his words. "I don't tell this story to point fingers or to dwell on what went wrong. I share it because it shows us the power of honesty, fairness, and standing together. We need to listen to each other more, treat each other with respect, and be willing to learn." As he finished, the room erupted into applause. James felt a mix of relief and pride. He had spoken from the heart, and it seemed to resonate with the crowd. After the event, people approached him to shake his hand and thank him for his words. One young man, no older than 20, said, "Mr. Carter, you've inspired me to keep fighting for what's right. Thank you for sharing your story." James smiled. "Thank you for listening." he replied. That's where it all starts. As he left the center that day, James realized that his experience, while difficult, had sparked something bigger than himself. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about making sure everyone had the chance to be heard and treated with dignity. After the community meeting, James's life started to shift in ways he hadn't expected. People in the city saw him not just as a taxi driver, but as a symbol of fairness and resilience. His story had sparked important conversations about justice, and he found himself at the center of a movement he never planned to lead. One afternoon, James received a call from a local organization focused on promoting equity and inclusion. The caller, a woman named Grace, introduced herself as the director. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice kind and steady, "we've been inspired by your story. We're hosting a community event next month, and we'd love for you to join us as a speaker. We believe your experience can help us educate and unite people." James was hesitant. He wasn't a public speaker by nature, but something about Grace's words made him pause. "I'm not sure what I could add," he said modestly. "I'm just a regular guy." "Exactly," Grace replied. "Your story is powerful because it's real. People connect with you because they see themselves in your shoes. You don't have to be anyone special to make a difference." After a moment, James agreed. He wanted to use his experience to help others, and this felt like the right opportunity. In the days leading up to the event, James reflected on everything that had happened. He thought about how quickly Margaret's false accusation could have ruined his life if not for the dashcam and the support of those who believed in him. He realized how many others might not be as fortunate, and it gave him a sense of responsibility to speak up for those who couldn't. When the day of the event arrived, James found himself standing in front of a larger crowd than he had ever imagined. The room was filled with people from all walks of life: students, professionals, parents, and even a few city officials. Grace introduced him, and as James approached the microphone, he felt a wave of nervousness. Taking a deep breath, he began. "Good evening, everyone. I'm James Carter, and I'm here today not because I wanted to be, but because of something that happened to me. A situation that could have gone very differently if not for the truth." He went on to share his story, describing the moment Margaret accused him, the support he received from bystanders, and the relief he felt when the dashcam footage cleared his name. "I'm lucky," he said, his voice steady. "But not everyone gets that chance, and that's why we're here, to make sure everyone has a voice and a fair shot." As he spoke, the audience was captivated. His words were simple but powerful, and by the time he finished, the room erupted in applause. Grace stepped forward to thank him, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Your story has reminded us all why we need to keep fighting for fairness," she said. "Thank you, James, for your courage." As James left the stage, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He hadn't asked to be in the spotlight, but now that he was determined to use it to make a difference. In the weeks following the event, James found his life settling into a new normal. He continued driving his taxi, interacting with passengers from all walks of life, but he noticed something different. Many people recognized him from the video or his speeches, and their reactions were overwhelmingly positive. "You're the driver who stood up for himself," one passenger said during a ride. "What you did inspired me." "Thank you." James appreciated the kind words, but he remained humble. "I just did what I thought was right," he would say. Still, deep down, he felt a sense of pride knowing his story had touched so many lives. One afternoon, as he parked his taxi to grab a quick lunch, a familiar face approached him. It was Margaret. Her expression was far from the confident one she had worn during their first encounter. Instead, she looked nervous, even apologetic. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice soft, "I owe you a real apology. What I did to you was wrong. There's no excuse for it. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and I caused you unnecessary harm." James looked at her, his face calm but serious. "You did," he said simply, "but I appreciate you coming here to say that." Margaret nodded, her voice trembling. I've learned a lot since that day. Seeing how people reacted to the truth and how you handled yourself with dignity made me realize how much harm words can do. I want to do better. James studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. It's good to hear that, he said. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do to fix them. The conversation left James with a sense of closure he hadn't expected. He didn't harbor anger toward Margaret. He saw her as someone who had made a bad decision and now wanted to change. It reinforced his belief that people could learn and grow if they were willing to reflect. As time passed, James's story became a lasting reminder of the importance of fairness and honesty. The taxi company where he worked installed dashcams in all their vehicles, using James's experience as a case study for why it was necessary. The local police department also introduced training sessions on how to handle reports with care and avoid snap judgments. James continued to be involved in community events, sharing his story and encouraging others to stand up for themselves, while promoting understanding and respect. He found fulfillment in helping people see the power of truth and the strength in treating everyone with dignity. One evening, as James drove home after a long day, he looked out at the city lights and smiled. Life had thrown him an unexpected challenge, but he had turned it into an opportunity to make a difference. He didn't see himself as a hero, just someone who believed in doing what was right. For James, that was enough. And as he parked his taxi for the night, he felt at peace, knowing his journey had helped not only himself but countless others along the way.